The past tenses in French come from Latin, which had a set of synthetic past forms, like the perfect, imperfect, and pluperfect. As Latin changed to Vulgar Latin and then Old French, many of the endings eroded, and speakers began to use periphrastic speech, consisting of auxiliary verbs and participles. While Old French kept a synthetic simple past, which later became the literary past, over time, spoken French shifted to compound forms for everyday past references. A different aspect that survived was the imperfect, which kept its role by showing habitual and ongoing past states, which is functionally distinct from a completed action. In one way, French also developed compound equivalents for anterior relationships and literary forms, like the past before another past. Eventually, periphrastic forms came with meanings, and colloquial registers also showed constructions for advanced developments and varieties. This short history lesson explains why French has multiple past tenses, and throughout these videos, we'll see each one and understand the individual function of the past. When it comes to learning the past, it can be hard to understand auxiliary verbs, along with participles that must agree in gender and number. These rules are direct consequences of how the compound system evolved, and the tenses really emphasize aspect, register, and time. So, it's important to learn what each tense does in storytelling. Later, learning the grammar of the past, along with auxiliaries and agreement, will be simple. Let's begin with the compound past. Le passé composé. It's built from an auxiliary verb, avoir, to have, or être, to be, in the present, plus a past participle. It's the tense many speakers use to talk about completed past actions. In one way, it's very similar to the English present perfect and simple past, as it can often be translated as either, depending on context. Still, its usage aligns more with the English simple past, in spoken and narrative French. The structure of the compound past has an auxiliary verb and a past participle, just like the English present perfect. As a note, the tense originally corresponded to the English present perfect, and can still be used in that way to express actions completed at an unspecified time in the past. However, the primary function is to express a single completed action, which in English is usually expressed with the simple past. The distinction between I did, simple past, and I have done, present perfect, does not exist in French. Instead, context determines the translation. So, the pattern is the subject plus the present tense of avoir or être plus a past participle, and we can see their conjugations in this table. J'ai, tu as, il, on a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. Je suis, tu es, il, on est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils, elles sont. These are the conjugations that we must use in the tense, but all of them will be with past participles. In general, they're not too difficult to remember, because regular verbs have simple forms. The form of the participles is made by simply removing the verb ending and adding a new ending. Verbs have the ending et, like saying, j'ai parlé, I spoke. Verbs have the ending I, like saying, tu as fini, you finished. Reverbs have the ending U, like saying, nous avons vendu, we sold. So, for regular verbs, the form is straightforward. Auxiliary plus a root plus an ending. However, we must consider the irregular forms that exist for many verbs, but it's something I'll explain in the end. Moreover, it's important to understand which auxiliary verb to use. Avoir or être. Generally, most verbs use avoir, but some intransitive verbs of movement or change of state use être. In other words, all pronominal and reflexive verbs use être because they're verbs of motion. Although knowing every verb in this category is impossible, the most common ones are devenir, revenir, monter, rester, sortir, venir, aller, naître, descendre, entrer, retourner, tomber, rentrer, arriver, mourir, and partir. While some are variants, others have irregular forms when put in participle form, which again, I'll show later. Some examples can be il est arrivé, elle est née, nous sommes revenus. As a note, some verbs can take both verbs depending on the meaning, like saying il est monté, he went up, être. Il a monté la valise, he brought up the suitcase, avoir, because there's a direct object. The most important concept to know is the agreement of the past participle, which can change its ending. 1. Verbs with être will make the past participle agree with the subject in gender and number. Il est allé, masculine, singular, so it has no ending. Elle est allée. We add et because it's feminine singular. Nous sommes partis. It's masculine and it's a mixed plural, so we add s even though it's silent. Ils sont partis. It's a feminine plural, so we add is, even though it's also silent. Such agreements must be known for participles. 2. Normally, the participle doesn't agree with the subject when avoir is used, but there is a very vital exception. If there is a direct object that comes before the verb, that is, a preceding direct object pronoun, then the past participle will agree with the preceding direct object. For example, je l'ai vu. Le means la fille, the girl, which is feminine and singular, so it receives the ending et, even though it's silent. Vu, when it's a pronoun. 3. Usually, pronominal verbs use être, and thus the participle agrees with the subject. However, if the reflexive pronoun is not the direct object, then there is no agreement, like saying, il s'est lavé les mains. Les mains is the direct object after the verb, so its participle remains lavé. There is no extra et. Additionally, when the reflexive is indirect, like se parler, ils se sont parlé, there is no agreement, because se is the indirect object. Considering how difficult it may be to explain and learn these exceptions, this is why practicing agreement with preceding direct objects is the best way to understand the compound past. This is where many mistakes can happen in your learning, but that's okay, because by paying attention to verbs that change auxiliary depending on meaning, making side-by-side examples, and practicing with object pronouns, you will slowly understand where to put them to see how they affect agreement and word order. For instance, when it comes to negation, questions, and pronouns in the compound past, placement rules have to be considered. Negation wraps the auxiliary by placing the two parts of the negation, ne, pas, on each side of the auxiliary verb. In other words, the auxiliary verb goes in between ne, pas, and the participle goes to the end, like je n'ai pas vu, nous ne sommes pas arrivés. On the other hand, object pronouns go before the auxiliary, keeping the participle in the end, like je l'ai vu, nous nous sommes parlé. As a note, if a pronoun precedes the verb and is a direct object, it will trigger agreement, which I showed previously. Other examples can be tu n'as pas compris, you didn't understand. L'as-tu vu? Have you seen him or her? The question uses inversion with the auxiliary. After learning all of these functions in the compound past, we can finally see what irregular participles look like, considering that they have special and unpredictable endings, which must be memorized separately. Although the common endings are e, i, u, many participles will look different, by a, changing their stems, b, adopting the u ending, or c, having completely unique forms. Because knowing all irregular participles is impossible, here we can see the most common useful ones, with examples. Avoir becomes eu. J'ai eu un problème. Être becomes été. Elle a été malade. Faire becomes fait. Nous avons fait nos devoirs. Prendre becomes pris. Tu as pris le bus. Mettre becomes mis. Il a mis la table. Voir becomes vu. J'ai vu ce film. Boire becomes bu. Ils ont bu du café. Lire becomes lu. J'ai lu le journal. Dire becomes dit. Il a dit la vérité. Écrire becomes écrit. J'ai écrit une lettre. Savoir becomes su. Nous avons su la nouvelle. Pouvoir becomes pu. Il a pu venir. Vouloir becomes voulu. J'ai voulu partir. Devoir becomes dû. Tu as dû travailler. Connaître becomes connu. J'ai connu cette ville autrefois. Vivre becomes vécu. Ils sont vécus en France. Tenir becomes tenu. Il a tenu sa promesse. Venir becomes venu. Être. Elle est venue hier. These were all examples of the most common irregular participles, but it's also common to find more if you want to know them all. In the compound past, the biggest takeaway is that irregular verbs are only irregular in their past participle form. Once you memorize those participles, the conjugation is systematic. Subject plus auxiliary, avoir or être in the present, plus the memorized participle. Overall, these are all of the concepts you need to know about the French compound past. It's used for completed past actions, short past events, or past events with a present result. First, you decide which auxiliary verb to use, then conjugate it in the present, add the participle of the main verb, and apply agreement rules if there are any. As a note, in written and literary narratives, the simple past may be used instead of the compound, because in spoken French, the compound past is almost always preferred. I'm mentioning this because in the next videos, the rest of the French past tenses will be explained, including the literary past, so it's important to understand such ideas ahead of time.